episode 150.
What is a witch?
Just that question, what is a witch? It's such an incredibly multifaceted and mutable concept.
The question of defining witchcraft, I think, is an almost notoriously difficult question. There are some scholars today who would almost give up when it comes to defining witchcraft and say that witchcraft is whatever people who consider themselves to be witches do, or it is whatever people who are accused by others of being witches are said to do. There's huge semantic confusion about what's being talked about when the issue of witchcraft is raised.
The whole exercise of defining witchcraft itself is so complicated because it's not only, like I said before, it's not only a problem in India, but it's a problem everywhere. But then every single community is viewing it differently. It's viewing it through different glasses.
Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson, and the quotes you just heard were from Doctors Malcolm Gaskill, Francis Young, and Amit Anand, and they were all said on this podcast right here in previous episodes.
And I'm Sarah Jack. We are descendants of the New England witch trials, and we're human rights advocates. We created this space where all the complexities of witchcraft and witchcraft accusations are discussed and accessible to the public.
The witch means different things to different people. This episode will examine what a witch has been in historical contexts, what a witch is perceived to be in ongoing global crises, and how the term is understood by modern self-identified practitioners, tracing the evolution of this complex concept.
We acknowledge the ambiguity of the witch. Some people view witchcraft positively, while others see it as something negative. And some see it as both good and bad.
Do we still believe in witches?
We all have magical thinking. Some of it is fantasy, some of it is superstitious, some of it is spiritual belief. But there's a lot of magical thinking. But that's not exactly what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about what is the witch.
Do we still need witches?
That's a good question to be thinking about while we go through who needed witches in the past and what they were.
Why did they need them? What were they for? What purpose does it serve to call somebody a witch? We'll begin this trip by looking back at ancient times and the Middle Ages. Witches have been in existence since the earliest writings by people. And you can look back at ancient Mesopotamia as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE. So in the 3rd millennium BCE and into the 2nd millennium BCE, witches were seen as normal folk. They were traditional healers and magical practitioners like cunning folk.
They became a threat as Mesopotamian cities grew and urban life emerged, bringing a sense of otherness to the community. The problem shifted from doing evil to being evil, to being a witch.
The witch was primarily understood as an illegitimate practitioner of magic, in contrast to the legitimate exorcists.
Witches were often portrayed as women, though texts do show both male and female witches.
You're probably noticing a lot of similar things to Mesopotamian witches as to witches later on in history, and you'll see these recurring themes as we go through this. Things like witches being women. Witches were also believed to be highly aggressive and capable of influencing gods, demons, or ghosts to harm victims. So conjuring.
Sounds so familiar. They were blamed for misfortunes. Again, something we can completely understand by looking at our world today. Misfortunes such as illness were seen as a threat to the divine order.
The Creator had made humans to work, to do physical labor, things with their hands, and not take shortcuts like witches were doing with magic.
There was significant fear that a woman witch could take away power and the sense of being from men, particularly because personal gods were often deceased male relatives, and many faiths across all eras have ancestral saints and gods.
In ancient Mesopotamia, accusations and punishment were often carried out by common folk, including river ordeals, where in this case, drowning signified guilt, not innocence, as we'll see later with the river ordeals.
Oh, that is fascinating. So it's a different outcome to a swim test.
It's the opposite, and I'd really like to understand what was behind why drowning signified guilt and floating signified innocence, and then that got changed later on.
The punishment included practices of burning the witch to purify the victim, indicating the witch was an enemy of the state and inherently evil.
Now, moving on to Greece and Rome, other classical sources mention witchy figures like Circe and Medea, and dangerous magical beings that, especially those that come out at night, such as the Lamia, child-eating monsters, Lilith, a female Jewish demon, the Grae, the Grey Sisters, and the Gorgons, like Medusa.
The early theories about playing witches included the notion of dangerous beings out there in the world that fly by night, often taking animal forms like screech owls or bats. Again, here is a fear that many people have today about danger and evil flying through the night.
In the classical period, while these figures existed, the direct attachment of this image to actual human women as being witches was more of a literary construct than a seriously held belief in daily life. However, legal repression of magic practices dates back to Roman law, even before Christianity. So there were cases where humans were identified as witches and punished for it. They weren't calling necessarily their neighbor a witch. They were thinking of, oh, the gods created these witches that are powerful creatures.
Yeah, but there was limits on magical practices, on what was allowed legally.
There was basically, if you were harming people, you could get arrested for that. But if you weren't harming people, you could practice love magic, blessings, charms, cures for diseases, and good luck practices, as well as curses. So basically, the toolkit that cunning folk had in the early modern period and throughout the Middle Ages, it was used by their predecessors back in Roman and Greek times.
And those things are still a part of our marketplace today.
Yes, and
When I say,
growing.
when I say our, I mean global market for charms and blessings and love.
So this magical marketplace has been robust since the beginning of recorded history. And now we'll move on to the early and Middle Ages. So in the early Middle Ages, as we were talking about with the classical period, this kind of carries over. Magic is viewed as practical stuff that reflected people's need to control their world. Sometimes this is referred to as service magic. We've done an episode of this podcast with Tabitha Stanmore, where she talks all about service magic in the early modern period. But the things that they did, the list of services, finding lost items, healing, counter magic, unwitching, those are the common services that you find around the world throughout time.
In this period, the church's view was skeptical. They generally viewed witchcraft claims in a skeptical fashion, seeing them as imposture. The theological work, Canon Episcopi from 906 CE, stated the belief in witches flying at night was a non-Christian belief. Commerce with demons and night flying were not permissible.
The first account of a female witch enlisting the devil appeared in the early 12th century was the story of the Witch of Barclay, which you've heard on here on an episode with Dr. Richard Raiswell. But the Witch of Berkeley was described as a solitary figure, not part of a vast sect, and primarily harmed only herself and not other people.
Fun fact, Sarah Jack loves the Witch of Berkeley story so much. I love it. Policy was more interested in behavior rather than defining a person as a witch. So what were their actions?
So moving on to the late Middle Ages, beginning in the 12th century and going onwards, the church became increasingly concerned with heresy. And this marked a significant shift in how witches were viewed.
Have you noticed that we have mentioned demons, but we have not talked about the devil yet? We have not used the word diabolical. So at this time, the concept of a witch transitioned from a local malefic practitioner to an agent of the devil as part of a vast, secret anti-Christian conspiracy. And this is known as the elaborated conception of witchcraft, or the elaborated theory.
This shift was largely fueled by the belief that witches gained their powers directly from Satan through a pact rather than having innate inborn abilities. This demonic pact often involved renouncing God, taking an oath to the devil, and having sexual intercourse with demons or the devil himself.
The publication of texts like Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, at the end of the 15th century played a crucial role in standardizing and disseminating this cumulative conception of witchcraft across Europe.
Witchcraft became profoundly gendered. While earlier concepts might have included men, the Malleus Maleficarum notably focused on women as evil-doing women. Maleficarum is a feminine noun for evil witch, asserting they were more susceptible to the devil due to perceived weaknesses like lust, foolishness, and lack of faith, according to Heinrich Kramer.
Witches are thought to cause harm, maleficium, to people, children, livestock, and crops. They were also believed to cause misfortune, disease, accidents, or death. And like we pointed out, he standardized this stereotype.
Yes. And the printing press fueled getting that out to everybody. That's why we point to that particular book. And at this time, actions believed to be perpetrated by witches included shape-shifting into animals like cats or hares, flying on brooms or other domestic objects. Though this was believed to be enabled by the devil or an ointment, we have a great episode about the theory of the witch's flying ointment. They also were believed to attend Sabbats, these secret anti-Christian gatherings with demons or the devil, and engage in anti-Christian rituals like cannibalism, eating babies. In New England, later on in the early modern period, we see the idea of flying witches attending Sabbats come over from Swedish witch trials.
Because of this book and the response to this book, accused witches were seen as malicious women, or the anti-woman, whose very soul opposed femininity and motherhood. They were believed to harm fertility.
They were often, though not always, marginalized individuals, people with low social status, poor or contrarian women. Men did face accusations, though they were a notable minority. But in a major witch panic, anyone of any gender or social status could be accused.
The witch became a useful enemy and a scapegoat for societal fears and misfortunes, especially during times of social stress, religious conflict, and political upheaval.
Despite common stereotypes, all accused were actually just ordinary people, unjustly accused, completely innocent of the charges of witchcraft, which were imagined. Confessions were often coerced through torture, including witch pricking, waking, watching, thumbscrews, the boot, and more of the medieval selection of tortures.
Cunning folk, cunning persons, wise women, and men, who primarily used magic for beneficial purposes, could still be accused of witchcraft by zealous authorities who saw all magic as diabolical.
Now, coming to the period that we spend most of the time on this podcast talking about, the early modern period, let's learn about what the perceptions were of the witch in that context when the witch trials took off.
In the witch trial era, the witch was understood as an entirely malign concept. This perception was based on the belief that a person could covenant with the devil to gain power to harm others, to hurt their community, to go against the plan of the patriarchal government and ministers. Like, that's the story that you see in New England. Satan was believed to bestow these powers, having received limited power from God to punish the sinful or test the righteous. I just read today in John Hale's Modest Inquiry where he reflects back and says, remember that time when God let the devil blah, blah, blah?
And I want to point out that in the early modern period, really, the elaborated theory of witchcraft was still in place, still was the basis for the witch trials. And works like the Malleus Maleficarum were very influential throughout the entire period of the European witch hunt. All the witch trials were predicated on the witch being in this pact with the devil and being part of this massive conspiracy against both church and state. So you had both religious and secular authorities very frightened about this. And that's why really the witch hunts took off the way that they did. And that's why in Salem and others like it, big witch panics, the question was always, so you were a witch, who else was a witch with you? Because they wanted to unravel this massive plot and had to find all the witches. You couldn't just take the one who had harmed the neighbor. And so the behaviors that were believed to be done by witches were very much the same as those believed throughout the later part of the Middle Ages when this diabolical concept came into play. But you'd notice that these behaviors were also very similar to what we reported in Mesopotamia. There were maleficium, like Sarah mentioned a minute ago, making people ill, killing people, harming livestock, killing crops, causing various misfortunes, bad luck, disease, accidents, death. These were the things that witches were believed to do that were harmful.
And in some contexts, there were large witch gatherings. So they would supernaturally fly. The devil would bring them to these gatherings or transport them, give them the power to transport, where they were believed to attend the devil's Sabbath. And so that idea was a continental witch. It became part of New England's belief, but it came right out of Europe contexts.
Yeah, that started in the Western Alps in the early 15th century and spread out. And the Malleus Maleficarum really spread it like a wildfire once that printing press. Gutenberg, you did a great thing, but it was used for very sinister purposes. So now I've got mixed emotions about the printing press.
Oh, we just,
Good thing, bad thing, both.
yeah, it's like technology is going to move forward, but what do we do with it?
Exactly. People today use cell phones and YouTube and TikTok to spread messages about witchcraft beliefs.
And fear and hate, but also for good.
Yeah.
You had the stereotype, but the actual victims of accusations didn't necessarily always meet those stereotypes.
That's a really good point. Let's talk about the appearance of witches in early modern beliefs. Now, this is, of course, the concept of a witch, what a witch is supposed to look like. This isn't talking about what the victims of witch trials looked like or any other qualities, because as we said before, they were innocent people and they weren't diabolical, doing evil deeds against their neighbors.
They had a very clear description of who a witch was, but then when you look at who the victims turned out to be, especially in panics where there were multiple accused, you find it could have been anybody that ends up with that label.
So the image of what a witch was supposed to look like back then, and you can see this in early modern artworks, you can read about this in books, especially by the skeptics, which were trying to show that the people that were being accused of witchcraft were victims, that they had sometimes some mental illness or a disability, and that caused them to behave a little bit differently, say different things than other people, and they were misunderstood. So that was the skeptical argument. But the prevailing stereotype was a lot like what we have in our Halloween witch today and what you would read in a book like Hansel and Gretel. They were generally women. In the witch trials in Europe, we know 80 to 85% of the victims were women, and a lot of the accused men were related to women who were accused or were otherwise not fulfilling the image that people had of what a man was supposed to be. Somehow they were doing a bad job at being married or raising their kids, something like that.
Another aspect of the description of a witch would be identifying a witch. And we know, looking at so many stories, that accused were examined physically for signs of being a witch. And they had physical marks that the examining team, sometimes men, sometimes women, including midwives, they were looking for specific physical marks that were believed to be witch teats. And those were spots where the devil or demons or the witch's evil helper was feeding from them, suckling from them on their witch marks.
The witch and women during this time in general were associated very closely with domestic items. That's why you have a witch being so closely tied to a broomstick and a cauldron, because those were women's tools in the house of the early modern period. And this became incorporated into the legends of witches, them using broomsticks, cauldrons, other household things. They're making ointments, they're doing the first aid in the neighborhood, that kind of thing that associates with women in the early modern.
The witch was also anticipated to be a subversive figure, one who challenged societal norms, religious norms, spoke their minds, or were different in some way. And so when you see these victims in the stories, those actions in their lives or their behaviors that fit subversion are what are highlighted and used to prove, hey, this might be a witch here. She's talking back. She's arguing. She's unsatisfied. She's complaining. She's not agreeing. She's not collaborating, and on and on.
Yeah, she's not being a woman, as we say that women need to be women. We, being the men of the time, of course, throwing this onto people, believing that the witch was this anti-mother figure who worked against fertility. That's another piece of how they were subversive. They were subverting the gender roles and expectations of the time.
So when you have a concept that is diabolical, dangerous, harmful, subversive, that is a useful enemy. That is the person, that is the thing that you're going to blame for misfortunes, crop failure, and the failure of the leadership in a community. Any failure that's happening that's an embarrassment or a devastation, you need somebody to blame that on. It's the witch.
Once again, I just want to reiterate that these women who were accused of witchcraft, these men, these children that were accused, they were all just folk. They were regular people like you and me with ordinary human abilities and not in league with the devil. In the modern context, there are basically two main definitions of the witch that we're going to discuss today. The witch in modern contexts reveals ongoing crises and also reclaimed identity. So there are the witch as the evil figure and the witch as the neutral or positive figure.
In many parts of the world today, including where alleged witches are hunted, in nations across every permanently inhabited continent, that is not an exaggeration, it's reality, there, in all those places, the term witch still signifies an evildoer using magic, occult forces, or spirits for personal gain, or to cause harm to others. And that isn't always viewed as diabolical, but it is about causing harm to others.
When we say witches in Africa, we mean people who fly out at night and go and suck blood on the roadside. That's what we mean. And when we say witches exist, that's what we're addressing. So for us, at our organization, it is a myth. Nobody flies out at night while others are sleeping to go and suck blood on the roadside. Nobody flies out at night to go and poison people and kill them spiritually and all that.
And so people are still accused of performing witchcraft to hurt their neighbors. And that leads to what are known as harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks, which are acts of violence, usually not judicially sanctioned, carried out against innocent people who usually have nothing to do with magic, let alone evil witchcraft.
Like Josh said, it's physical violence, it's torture. They are socially ostracized. It devastates them economically, psychologically. They are traumatized, and many are dying. Thousands, predominantly women and elderly individuals, are accused, tried, attacked, killed, imprisoned, or banished annually.
We see reports of this every single day. We get multiple reports from multiple countries of some kind of attack or harm against someone accused of witchcraft. And those reports, sadly, frequently feature children and people with disabilities or conditions like dementia that are misunderstood because the conditions are misinterpreted as supernatural.
Hopefully, you're recognizing from what we're telling you that the witch hunt mentality, not just figuratively, but actually, the witch hunt mentality is fully alive, and it's not merely a historical reflection. We reflected on the history, but everything that you've learned about what a witch is, that is happening.
There is a clear distinction between these ongoing witch hunts, which are prosecutions of people who generally don't practice magic, or if they do it for a positive reason, but they're usually not self-identified witches most of the time.
We do recognize that those that identify as witches and have a craft that they practice do experience persecution and are facing religious freedom persecutions. So they're very distinct persecutions that are happening.
And a very important report just came out a few days ago about this modern crisis. We'll have a link to that in the show notes so you can get more in depth on what is happening.
This report that Josh mentioned is from the International Network Against Witchcraft Accusations. and ritual attacks. The International Network, we call it. The internationalnetwork.org is where you find out about that amazing organization. Lancaster University and the Australian National University looked at the legislative approaches taken across the world to respond to these harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. And that report that just came out is called The Legislative Approaches to Addressing Harmful Practices Related to Witchcraft, Accusations, and Ritual Attacks, a Global Review. It sounds jargony, it sounds academic, but don't be intimidated by how it sounds. The report is really easy to read through and get a perspective of the data. So please do go to our show notes and pull up that report and look at it and keep your eye peeled for if End Witch Hunts nonprofit is cited in there. And also our colleague Mary Bingham has an article that is cited in that report.
The good news is that though these horrible things are happening against innocent people, there are organizations working to have legislation and other measures taken to protect people from being accused of witchcraft and attacked. There are organizations like Advocacy for Alleged Witches out of Nigeria, Advocacy Against Witch Hunts out of South Africa. End Witch Hunts is our organization that raises awareness about this. Sarah mentioned the International Network Against Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks. There's also an international alliance to end witch hunts. And there's Stop Child Witch Accusations. Those are just the tip of the iceberg as far as organizations, but we've done interviews with representatives of all those organizations. So you can go back to our back catalog and review what actions are actually being taken to solve this problem.
So we talked about the ongoing crisis of women and children and sometimes men being attacked as evil witches. We've talked a little bit about identifying as a witch as a positive thing. But there's another aspect of witch in our modern culture which is not acceptable, and that's the witch in slurs. It's still used to insult women every day from podiums of leadership and the news and writings and you name it. It's there.
So people, especially men, still call women witches whenever they have any kind of power, if they are in a leadership role, if they're experts on subjects or issues, or they're in politics. But also every day, this word gets tossed around so casually, like it means nothing. It's used against any woman who says or does anything that's interpreted. And that's the important part. That's interpreted as mean-spirited. So if you think that somebody was rude to you, maybe your boss is being a little demanding or micromanaging. You say, "Oh, my boss is such a witch." That's wrong. Don't say that. We've told you what the word witch means. Your boss is not that. And that word is still being used to kill people today. That's why we're so opposed to it. It's also very misogynist. Do you call your male boss a witch? Probably not. You might have other language for him, but it doesn't mean somebody that we're supposed to kill, which does. The witch has become a very important figure in feminist theory because of the misogyny, the actions of the patriarchy against women in the witch trials. We've talked to Inez Tadeo about the woman as witch, the belief that all women are flawed, that they've inherited Eve's sin, and therefore they are working against men, they're working against humanity, they're working against God. Sinful creatures by nature. And of course, rightly, women have come back today and said, hell no, that's not who we are. We're women. We can be empowered. We can be powerful. We can be everything that the patriarchy is. Let women have a share of that and stop calling them witches and relegating them to this lower position. So the witch has become a very powerful symbol of female empowerment. And that brings us to the appearance of the witch in the modern era. We've seen a lot of this move to reclaim what the witch is and give it a different kind of portrayal.
I love how pop culture is portraying the witch in ways to teach us about our humanity and friendships and who women are in their relationships with women and men. And it's been a significant cultural shift. And the clearest example, one that's very fun and I love to bring up, is L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz. And then what we have now from that story, the Wicked franchise, the Broadway, the movie, the books.
Yeah, you see that a witch can be a good figure like Glinda. You also see that witches can be more nuanced characters. They can be shades of gray, not necessarily evil or good, just like regular folk. We're not evil or good. We're all somewhere in between with little bits and pieces from each of those things. So we see this a lot in the film and television and theater of today. It's wonderful. And other programs that came out in the 60s and 70s, especially, but also in the 90s, I call them the zeros, you might call them the naughties or the aughts, whatever, the 2000s. You've seen shows like Bewitched and Sabrina the Teenage Witch, where the witch is portrayed as a good figure that helps people and does nice things with their magic. And you learn a lot of lessons in especially Sabrina the Teenage Witch about the abuse of power and how witches should have ethics. So it's a very nuanced look. And you have things like The Craft, that's a bit of a darker look, Charmed. They're all different looks, but they're showing that witches can be regular folk. Just like the people who were accused of witchcraft, who were totally innocent, were regular folk.
But with Charmed and The Craft, you have individuals making decisions for themselves about what kind of choices they're going to make and if they're going to help and harm, putting the power back in their own hands, where with witchcraft accusations, people are being told that they're evil.
And I love how things like Wicked, they use the traditional stereotypes. They make use of Elphaba with the black hat, the green face, the pointy nose. It's all part of this old stereotype, but now they're being used to challenge those stereotypes, to show how absurd they are. And you see Glinda the Good, who's all pink and light and happy and airy. And then you see Elphaba making decisions for herself, like Sarah talked about, and being empowered and being a nuanced person who's not totally evil. She's actually doing things for what she believes are good reasons. Now, there is a central location where you can go to the Witch City, Salem, Massachusetts, and you can learn about all kinds of witches. You can learn about the stereotype witches. You can learn about the people accused of witchcraft in the witch trials who had nothing to do with it. Salem in 1692 was a very intolerant place. And the Salem of today goes out of the way to be one of the most tolerant places around. So you can see both the history and you can see the modern interpretations of what witchcraft is and what a witch is to those people who have embraced that religion. And we talk more about Salem witch trials on our other podcast, The Thing About Salem. Listen today.
Today we looked at what a witch has been and what it is. And that is because Understanding the diverse and evolving definitions of a witch is crucial for comprehending and combating the ongoing global crisis of witch hunts and for understanding how we interact with each other as a family or as a community, as a world community.
Yeah, this crisis of these ongoing witch hunts is driven by fear, which leads people to disregard human dignity and persecute innocent people. So when we're confronted with such fear that is driving us to want to take extreme measures, that's the time we need to apply critical thinking, stop and reason. Really think about things dispassionately for a moment and not rush to judgment or to throw blame on another person for some misfortune that's befallen you.
It is your responsibility. It's all of our responsibility to use our agency to end witch hunts. You do have a platform. It may just be bringing it up in conversation at your next social gathering. But if you write, if you speak, if you have a leadership role, if you're creating policy that affects the lives of people, use that platform to promote human dignity and to stop the fear of others.
Thank you so much for joining us today on this important episode discussing what a witch has been and what a witch is today. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.